Ocean Dread, Volume 2. The Harbour of Ghosts, by M.J. Bardine. It always came to me just at the edge of twilight, that strange figure. Never was there spoken word, yet I knew there was a message for me, could I but find the key. That was when I was very young, and could not put into words the idea which so dimly presented itself. The figure never came to me except in the old attic of my grandfather's house, where I loved to go in the afternoons after school hours, there to dream over the many strange things he had brought with him from the fascinating countries he had voyaged to in his ship, the Golden Gull, the ship that had disappeared that last fatal trip the year in which I was born. I was never afraid, for it seemed to be a natural thing, and the figure vague and gossamer, not unfriendly. These excursions into the attic lapsed during my term of apprenticeship in my father's shipbuilding yards. My family were all more or less seafaring. It was in the blood, and my father carried on the traditions of the family by building the more modern carriers of our flag in the merchant trade, and I was destined for the service. Thus it was that when I had finished my poring over maps, plans, and instruments, my father found a berth for me on the Joseph B., which followed in the paths of the long-gone Golden Gull in the China trade. I was soon ready for sea. My sea chest was aboard, and then before the ship sailed the next morning I journeyed the short distance down to the old house where I had spent so many of my childhood days with the old aunt who still lived there. Once more I was drawn to the attic to say goodbye to the strange weapons, the feathered headdresses, the sandalwood boxes and embroidered shawls that had journeyed with my grandfather through wind and rain, salt spume and torrid sun. And then once more the veiled figure came to me from the shadow of the carved screen whence it had always appeared. The eerie sensation of my youngster days came back to me as I felt its presence. The lips moved, and in the recesses of my brain echoed the whisper, "Go back, go back." What I was to go back from I did not know. Now, too late, I know. The figure faded and melted into the shadows as I pretended a bravery I did not feel. I left the attic telling myself it was all imagination, built up from some remembrance of my childhood days. The Joseph B. sailed next day with me at the rail. I felt very important and part of the great world as I stood there gazing back at the little group of relatives and family friends whom I now seem fated never to see again. I am writing this by the fitful gleam of a lantern hung at the taffrail on the Golden Gull. My God, yes, the Golden Gull. But wait, after I have set down a story so strange, so unbelievable, I will place what I have written in a bottle, cork it, and set it adrift, hoping that even should there be no escape for me from this ghastly place, some strange tide may carry word of my fate back to the world of living men. The first half of the voyage in the Joseph B. was uneventful to my shipmates, who had gone over the way so many times. But for me, who for the first time gazed upon the colourful ports, it was all strange and wonderful. The jargon of unfamiliar tongues, the noisome odours of the oriental waterfront making it all an epic of adventure. In Ceylon, we took on a load of teas and spices, silks and Chinese merchandise in Hong Kong, and so after loading turned to the long journey home. Then in the straits the glass started to fall. Ominous clouds gathered, and the wind blew until it seemed we were caught in a maelstrom of fury. The wheel refused to respond to human intelligence, and we were whirled hither and thither in the vortex of a sea seemingly gone mad with hatred of the puny thing which was our ship, now tossed like a cork, with straining seams and labouring engines. We had been taking turns at the pumps, for by now the ship was leaking badly, and after my period of duty, I went to my cabin and, utterly exhausted, threw myself on my bunk. I was asleep before my head touched the pillow. I must have slept quite some time, for I had dream after dream, or I should say nightmares, wherein the veiled figure was trying to hold me back from something. I was awakened by a terrific crash, the impact of which hurled me from my bunk against the door opposite. I shook myself together and gradually came back to the reality of what was going on. I could dimly hear the shouted orders of the captain on the deck outside, while the ship quivered in every timber and listed sharply. I managed to get the door open and staggered onto the sea-swept deck. A terrific flare of lightning showed our position. We were hard fast on a jutting rock, thrust up in the midst of the boiling sea, a rock which must have been the result of some submarine upheaval. We had struck almost amidships, or else the rock had been forced up under us, for the deck was splintered, telling me we were broken in two. Giant waves dashing against the rock drenched our bows, and the ship was being rapidly pounded to pieces. Drenched and shivering, I held on to a stanchion until I could steady myself in a slight measure. A wave tore loose my hold, and sliding, gasping for breath, I slid down against the rail, which I grasped with desperate strength and held while fresh seas poured over me. The captain, clinging to the splintered rail on the foredeck, stood shouting his orders, his stentorian voice heard even above the roar of the elements. "Man the boats!" was the order now given, though how a boat could live in that seething pit of hell I could not guess. As rapidly as possible, the crews responded, and the boats were swung out. One was smashed against the side of the ship, and the other capsized as it struck the water, spilling its human freight into the sea. And now I think our captain must suddenly have gone mad, for with uplifted fists and screaming an imprecation to the heavens above, he dived into the black depths that had claimed his crew. I was left alone, clinging as best I could to whatever had not been washed overboard. How long I struggled against being swept into the sea I do not know. But at length the wind died down, but the first faint streaks of dawn told me as I gazed at the sharp tongue of rock which pierced our vitals that I could not long remain aboard and live, for at any moment the ship might break. There was still one boat in the davits, so I hurriedly provisioned it from the cook's galley. The food and a plentiful supply of water I placed in the boat, and then set about getting over the side. This was not so difficult, as the side of the ship on which the boat was swung had listed until it was almost at the waterline. I cast off and slowly moved away, wallowing in the trough of the sea. I had gone only a short distance when there occurred a boiling of the water. A geyser shot up, and ship and rock sank from sight. I was now in very truth alone. I had no compass or sextant. I could only trust that I would drift to land or the path of some ship left alive by the storm. I'm going to keep a log. As near as I can determine, I have now been adrift 10 days. Our ship struck September 13th, on a Friday. This must be then September 23rd. It has been a period of sleeping and awakening. The sun has burned steadily down upon me, and I have sheltered myself as best I could under the canvas boat covering. September 24th. I have seen no sail of any kind. I seem to be caught in some current, carrying me steadily forward in the same direction. September 26th. I did not enter any happening in the log yesterday. Was it my imagination, born of my loneliness and despair, or did my fancy conjure up the veiled figure of my childhood? It seemed to sit there in the bow of the boat last night. Perhaps I'm going mad. September 27th. Still drifting. It is getting colder. September 28th. Still colder. I cannot understand this. Could I be drifting toward the Antarctic Circle? I must be traveling faster than I'm aware of. Later. I cannot date this, for I've been very ill and unconscious, and do not know how many days have elapsed. It is now very cold, and I've had to wrap myself in the canvas covering my stores. I hope I'm not deluding myself, but I seem to see the vague outlines of mountainous land. I'm too weak to row. I can only let the sea carry me. Perhaps it will cast me upon some strange shore. Later. I am still steadily drifting. The land, for it is land, is nearer. It is too dark now to write further in this undated log. That was the last entry I was fated to make in my log, for during the night I entered what seemed to be a subterranean passage. I had a feeling of being closed in, and the water seemed to be lapping against walls. I had given up hope of ever seeing the sky again, when suddenly I came out into a bay or harbor surrounded by towering cliffs of ice. I could only gaze in amazement and wonder if in some bygone age this could be the crater of a volcano, which the sea entered during the forming of the Ice Age, and so it has stood unchanged through countless centuries. High above the cliffs, the moon, pale and full of distant mystery, shone down upon the icy water. And then, as I grew accustomed to the half-light, I made out the outlines of many ships, all vague and silent, the shapes strange and different from any I had ever seen, except in pictures of the old sailing ships of my grandfather's day. For the first time in weeks I pulled upon my oars. The ice seemed to draw away and make a lane of clear water, which I followed to the nearest ship, and as I drew closer, a hope formed in my heart that I would find someone to share the now almost insupportable loneliness. "Ahoy!" I called, as my boat touched the side of the ship, but only an echo came back to me, thrown from the towering cliffs. With numb fingers, I made my boat fast to the rusted chain hanging from the ship's side, and then, as I started to climb aboard, I looked up at the almost obliterated name, and with a feeling of astonishment made out the lettering. The Golden Girl, my own grandfather's ship, and I of all the world knew now where that ship rested. A chill ran down my spine, yet I crawled over the rail. The moonlight threw into relief the coiled ropes on the deck as I slowly made my way to the chart room. I entered, and there seated at his table with the logbook open before him was a man. I spoke to him, but received no answer. I laid my hand upon his shoulder, but he did not move. Bending down, I peered into the bearded face, and it was the face I had seen in pictures in my childhood home. It was the face of my own grandfather, cold and immovable in death. The figure sat stony and rigid, the quill pen still held in the stiff fingers. I peered over his shoulder and read the last entry in the log before him. It was in the cramped handwriting I had seen in old letters and documents penned by my grandfather. I turned with tears coursing down my cheeks and looked again at that kindly dead face, and then once more read the log's entry. December 8th, 1888. I put over the side today all that was mortal of leather breeches, otherwise James Cogswell, the ship's carpenter. This freezing cold has done its work well. I will have to carry on as best I can, hoping that I may be delivered from this haunted harbor of lost souls. If only the storm had left us one boat, I might find a way out. If I can endure this cold, I will build a boat or raft and try to find... The entry stopped, broken off as though he had been interrupted. I left the chart room and made an inspection of the deck. Everything was ship-shape, and the deck as clean as though it had been holystone that day. I returned to the chart-room, and in the captain's quarters adjoining found his bunk neatly made up. Somehow I was not made nervous by that dead presence outside. I felt almost as if he protected me from some evil which seemed to be all about me. I lay down and drew the covers up about my face and fell asleep almost at once. I was awakened by the ghostly sound of a ship's bell. It was 1 o'clock, and then my hair rose on my head, for I heard in that graveyard of dead ships the words, "All's well," and then the culminating horror, for the chair was pushed back in the chart-room, and I heard the measured tread of footsteps. I raised up my head and looked through the door, and saw my dead grandfather come back to seeming life. My senses reeled, and I fell back upon the pillow. When next I opened my eyes, it was daylight. I again looked through the door into the chart-room. Once more that rigid figure sat there, the glassy eyes staring down at the log. I arose, wondering if it had all been hallucination born of the terrible experiences I had passed through. Quickly, I left the captain's quarters and went on deck and looked over the harbour. The ships lay silent, wrapped in mystery, no sign of life or sound. From the stores in my boat, I made a frugal breakfast, after which I decided to investigate the nearest ship. I slid down the chain into my boat. The ice in the harbour moved restlessly, showing here and there lanes of clear water. I took the chance of being crushed between the ice cakes rather than remain on the Golden Gull with its silent watcher. After a long time, during which I stood in my boat poling with one oar through the icy lanes, I reached the other ship, made fast, and clambered aboard. I looked about me. Oh, that I could erase from my memory the sight of what met my eyes. Sprawled about the deck were the dead members of what I now know to be that ship's unholy crew, one with a knife in his breast, another with his head crushed and half his face torn away, while a third, whom I took to be the captain, stood with a marlinspike in his hand, snarling down at the mutilated face, all frozen and immovable. I ran, stumbling to the side, and half fell into my boat. The Golden Gull with its dead master seemed a friendly place, and glad I was when I once more stood upon its deck. I took the lantern from the taffrail, and going below found a few pieces of old lumber, with which I made a fire in the cook's galley. The awful cold has settled in my very marrow, and I will try to warm myself as long as fuel lasts. Tonight, I am resolved to stay awake and learn what I can of this strange harbour of ghosts. I must have dozed off despite my resolution, for the fire was out, and there was a deadly chill in the air when I awoke. Just then the ship's bell sounded 1, and "All's well" echoed over the harbour. I looked out, and lights flickered from the silent ships about me. I heard again the measured tread of footsteps from the chart-room, and watched the figure of my grandfather come out. He stood near me for a moment, looking across at the ship I had visited that day, and I heard the dead lips mutter, "How long, O Lord, how long?" Then he moved to the rail, where he stood as though listening to the terrible oaths and bloodthirsty yells which came from that other strange ship. Frozen with horror, I too looked as lurid flames sprang up and revealed the fighting on that deck. All night long I watched the awful scenes repeated over and over, until they died with the coming of dawn, as I have watched every night since, until now, when I feel that I too am doomed to become one of this ghastly company in the harbour of dead ships. I have watched the dead man in the chart-room. In my loneliness have tried to talk to him, but he never turns his head to listen. I watch him go to the rail, stooping for something which he casts over the rail, perhaps the phantom form of Leather Breeches, the ship's carpenter. Then that unholy ship whereon men go through the form of murder nightly. Oh, that I could not see the happenings there, but something impels me to look and listen. It is bitter cold, and I feel the chill reaching to my heart, and I have just enough life left to place what I have written in this bottle and cast it over the side, with the hope it will drift out of this ice-locked harbour and fare to the pathway of ships on the bosom of some sunny sea. After I have done this, I will go to the chart-room and sit down by my dead grandfather, and remain with him in his silent vigil, believing that when the chill which is nearing my heart reaches my brain, I too will become one of this ghostly company in this graveyard of lost ships, and when 1 o'clock comes, I also will rise and walk again. The Mystery of the Derelict by William Hope Hodgson. All the night had the four-masted ship Tarawak lain motionless in the drift of the Gulf Stream, for she had run into a calm patch, into a stark calm which had lasted now for 2 days and nights. On every side, had it been light, might have been seen dense masses of floating gulf-weed, studding the ocean even to the distant horizon. In places, so large were the weed masses that they formed long, low banks that by daylight might have been mistaken for low-lying land. Upon the lee side of the poop, Duthie, one of the prentices, leaned with his elbows upon the rail and stared out across the hidden sea to where in the eastern horizon showed the first pink and lemon streamers of the dawn, faint, delicate streaks and washes of colour. A period of time passed, and the surface of the leeward sea began to show, a great expanse of grey, touched with odd, wavering belts of silver, and everywhere the black specks and islets of the weed. Presently, the red dome of the sun protruded itself into sight above the dark rim of the horizon, and, abruptly, the watching Duthie saw something, a great, shapeless bulk that lay some miles away to starboard, and showed black and distinct against the gloomy red mass of the rising sun. "Something in sight to leeward, sir," he informed the mate, who was leaning, smoking, over the rail that ran across the break of the poop. "I can't just make out what it is." The mate rose from his easy position, stretched himself, yawned, and came across to the boy. "Whereabouts, Toby?" he asked wearily and yawning again. "There, sir," said Duthie, alias Toby. "Broad away on the beam, and right in the track of the sun. It looks something like a big houseboat, or a haystack." The mate stared in the direction indicated, and saw the thing which puzzled the boy, and immediately the tiredness went out of his eyes and face. "Pass me the glasses off the skylight, Toby," he commanded, and the youth obeyed. After the mate had examined the strange object through his binoculars for maybe a minute, he passed them to Toby, telling him to take a squint and say what he made of it. "Looks like an old powder hulk, sir," exclaimed the lad after a while, and to this description the mate nodded agreement. Later, when the sun had risen somewhat, they were able to study the derelict with more exactness. She appeared to be a vessel of an exceedingly old type, mastless, and upon the hull of which had been built a roof-like superstructure, the use of which they could not determine. She was lying just within the borders of one of the weed banks, and all her side was splotched with a greenish growth. It was her position within the borders of the weed that suggested to the puzzled mate how so strange and unseaworthy-looking a craft had come so far abroad into the greatness of the ocean. for suddenly it occurred to him that she was neither more nor less than a derelict from the vast Sargasso Sea, a vessel that had possibly been lost to the world scores and scores of years gone, perhaps hundreds. The suggestion touched the mate's thoughts with solemnity, and he fell to examining the ancient hulk with an even greater interest, and pondering on all the lonesome and awful years that must have passed over her, as she had lain desolate and forgotten in that grim cemetery of the ocean. Through all that day, the derelict was an object of the most intense interest to those aboard the Tarawak, every glass in the ship being brought into use to examine her. Yet, though within no more than some 6 or 7 miles of her, the captain refused to listen to the mate's suggestions that they should put a boat into the water and pay the stranger a visit, for he was a cautious man, and the glass warned him that a sudden change might be expected in the weather, so that he would have no one leave the ship on any unnecessary business. But for all that he had caution, curiosity was by no means lacking in him, and his telescope, at intervals, was turned on the ancient hulk through all the day. Then, it would be about 6 bells in the second dog watch, a sail was sighted astern, coming up steadily but slowly. By 8 bells, they were able to make out that a small bark was bringing the wind with her, a yard squared and every stitch set. Yet the night had advanced apace, and it was nigh to 11 o'clock before the wind reached those aboard the Tarawak. When at last it arrived, there was a slight rustling and quaking of canvas, and odd creaks here and there in the darkness amid the gear, as each portion of the running and standing rigging took up the strain. Beneath the bows and alongside, there came gentle rippling noises as the vessel gathered way, and so, for the better part of the next hour, they slid through the water at something less than a couple of knots in the 60 minutes. To starboard of them, they could see the red light of the little bark, which had brought up the wind with her, and was now forging slowly ahead, being better able, evidently, than the big, heavy Tarawak to take advantage of so slight a breeze. About 11:45, just after the relieving watch had been roused, lights were observed to be moving to and fro upon the small bark, and by midnight it was palpable that, through some cause or other, she was dropping astern. When the mate arrived on deck to relieve the second, the latter officer informed him of the possibility that something unusual had occurred aboard the bark, telling of the lights about her decks, and how that, in the last quarter of an hour, she had begun to drop astern. On hearing the second mate's account, the first sent one of the prentices for his night glasses, and when they were brought, studied the other vessel intently, that is, so well as he was able through the darkness, for, even through the night glasses, she showed only as a vague shape, surmounted by the 3 dim towers of her masts and sails. Suddenly, the mate gave out a sharp exclamation, for, beyond the bark, there was something else shown dimly in the field of vision. He studied it with great intentness, ignoring for the instant the second's queries as to what it was that had caused him to exclaim. All at once he said, with a little note of excitement in his voice, "The derelict! The bark's run into the weed around that old hooker." The second mate gave a mutter of surprised assent and slapped the rail. "That's it," he said. "That's why we're passing her, and that explains the lights. If they're not fast in the weed, they've probably run slap into the blessed derelict." "One thing," said the mate, lowering his glasses and beginning to fumble for his pipe. "She won't have had enough way on her to do much damage." The second mate, who was still peering through his binoculars, murmured an absent agreement, and continued to peer. The mate, for his part, filled and lit his pipe, remarking meanwhile to the unhearing second that the light breeze was dropping. Abruptly, the second mate called his superior's attention, and in the same instant, so it seemed, the failing wind died entirely away, the sails settling down into runkles, with little rustles and flutters of sagging canvas. "What's up?" asked the mate, and raised his glasses. "There's something queer going on over yonder," said the second. "Look at the lights moving about, and did you see that?" The last portion of his remark came out swiftly, with a sharp accentuation of the last word. "What?" asked the mate, staring hard. "The shooting," replied the second. "Look, there again." "Rubbish," said the mate, a mixture of unbelief and doubt in his voice. With the falling of the wind, there had come a great silence upon the sea, and abruptly, from far across the water, sounded the distant, dullish thud of a gun, followed almost instantly by several minute but sharply defined reports, like the cracking of a whip out in the darkness. "Jove!" cried the mate. "I believe you're right." He paused and stared. "There," he said. "I saw the flashes then. They're firing from the poop, I believe. I must call the old man." He turned and ran hastily down into the saloon, knocked on the door of the captain's cabin, and entered. He turned up the lamp, and, shaking his superior into wakefulness, told him of the thing he believed to be happening aboard the bark. "It's mutiny, sir. They're shooting from the poop. We ought to do something." The mate said many things breathlessly, for he was a young man, but the captain stopped him, with a quietly lifted hand. "I'll be up with you in a minute, Mr. Johnson," he said, and the mate took the hint and ran up on deck. Before the minute had passed, the skipper was on the poop and staring through his night glasses at the bark and the derelict. Yet now, aboard of the bark, the lights had vanished, and there showed no more the flashes of discharging weapons. Only there remained the dull, steady red glow of the port side light, and behind it, the night glasses showed the shadowy outline of the vessel. The captain put questions to the mates, asking for further details. "It all stopped while the mate was calling you, sir," explained the second. "We could hear the shots quite plainly." "They seem to be using a gun as well as their revolvers," interjected the mate, without ceasing to stare into the darkness. For a while the three of them continued to discuss the matter, whilst down on the main deck the two watches clustered along the starboard rail, and a low hum of talk rose, fore and aft. Presently, the captain and the mates came to a decision. If there had been a mutiny, it had been brought to its conclusion, whatever that conclusion might be, and no interference from those aboard the Tarawak at that period would be likely to do good. They were utterly in the dark, in more ways than one, and, for all they knew, there might not even have been any mutiny. If there had been a mutiny, and the mutineers had won, then they had done their worst, whilst if the officers had won, well and good. They had managed to do so without help. Of course, if the Tarawak had been a man of war with a large crew, capable of mastering any situation, it would have been a simple matter to send a powerful, armed boat's crew to inquire. But as she was merely a merchant vessel, undermanned, as is the modern fashion, they must go warily. They would wait for the morning and signal. In a couple of hours it would be light. Then they would be guided by circumstances. The mate walked to the break of the poop, and sang out to the men, "Now then, my lads, you'd better turn in and have a sleep. We may be wanting you by 5 bells." There was a muttered chorus of "Aye, aye, sir," and some of the men began to go forward to the forecastle, but others of the watch below remained, their curiosity overmastering their desire for sleep. On the poop, the 3 officers leaned over the starboard rail, chatting in a desultory fashion, as they waited for the dawn. At some little distance hovered Duthie, who, as eldest prentice just out of his time, had been given the post of acting third mate. Presently, the sky to starboard began to lighten with the solemn coming of the dawn. The light grew and strengthened, and the eyes of those in the Tarawak scanned with growing intentness that portion of the horizon where showed the red and dwindling glow of the bark sidelight. Then, it was in that moment when all the world is full of the silence of the dawn, something passed over the quiet sea, coming out of the east, a very faint, long-drawn-out, screaming, piping noise. It might almost have been the cry of a little wind wandering out of the dawn across the sea, a ghostly, piping skirl, so attenuated and elusive was it. But there was in it a weird, almost threatening note, that told the three on the poop it was no wind that made so dree and inhuman a sound. The noise ceased, dying out in an indefinite, mosquito-like shrilling, far and vague and minutely shrill. And so came the silence again. "I heard that last night, when they were shooting," said the second mate, speaking very slowly, and looking first at the skipper and then at the mate. "It was when you were below, calling the captain," he added. "Shh," said the mate, and held up a warning hand. But though they listened, there came no further sound, and so they fell to disjointed questionings, and guessed their answers, as puzzled men will. And ever and anon they examined the bark through their glasses, but without discovering anything of note, save that, when the light grew stronger, they perceived that her jib-boom had struck through the superstructure of the derelict, tearing a considerable gap therein. Presently, when the day had sufficiently advanced, the mate sung out to the third to take a couple of the prentices and pass up the signal flags in the code-book. This was done, and a hoist made, but those in the bark took not the slightest heed, so that finally the captain bade them make up the flags and return them to the locker. After that, he went down to consult the glass, and when he reappeared, he and the mates had a short discussion, after which orders were given to hoist out the starboard lifeboat. This, in the course of half an hour, they managed, and after that, 6 of the men and 2 of the prentices were ordered into her. Then half a dozen rifles were passed down with ammunition, and the same number of cutlasses. These were all apportioned among the men, much to the disgust of the 2 apprentices, who were aggrieved that they should be passed over. But their feelings altered when the mate descended into the boat and handed them each a loaded revolver, warning them, however, to play no monkey tricks with the weapons. Just as the boat was about to push off, Duthie, the eldest prentice, came scrambling down the side ladder and jumped for the afterthwart. He landed and sat down, laying the rifle which he had brought in the stern, and, after that, the boat put off for the bark. There were now 10 men in the boat, and all well armed, so that the mate had a certain feeling of comfort that he would be able to meet any situation that was likely to arise. After nearly an hour's hard pulling, the heavy boat had been brought within some 200 yards of the bark, and the mate sung out to the men to lie on their oars for a minute. Then he stood up and shouted to the people on the bark, but though he repeated his cry of "Ship ahoy" several times, there came no reply. He sat down and motioned to the men to give way again, and so brought the boat nearer the bark by another 100 yards. Here he hailed again, but still receiving no reply, he stooped for his binoculars, and peered for a while through them at the 2 vessels, the ancient derelict and the modern sailing vessel. The latter had driven clean in over the weed, her stern being perhaps some 20 yards from the edge of the bank. Her jib-boom, as I have already mentioned, had pierced the green-blotched superstructure of the derelict, so that her cutwater had come very close to the grass-grown side of the hulk. That the derelict was indeed a very ancient vessel, it was now easy to see, for at this distance the mate could distinguish which was hull and which superstructure. Her stern rose up to a height considerably above her bows, and possessed galleries coming round the counter. In the window frame some of the glass still remained, but others were securely shuttered, and some missing, frames and all, leaving dark holes in the stern. and everywhere grew the dank green growth, giving to the beholder a queer sense of repulsion. Indeed, there was that about the whole of the ancient craft that repelled in a curious way, something elusive, a remoteness from humanity that was vaguely abominable. The mate put down his binoculars and drew his revolver, and, at the action, each one in the boat gave an instinctive glance to his own weapon. Then he sung out to them to give way and steered straight for the weed. The boat struck it, with something of a sog, and, after that, they advanced slowly, yard by yard, only with considerable labor. They reached the counter of the bark, and the mate held out his hand for an oar. This he leaned up against the side of the vessel, and a moment later was swarming quickly up it. He grasped the rail and swung himself aboard. Then, after a swift glance fore and aft, gripped the blade of the oar to steady it, and bade the rest follow as quickly as possible, which they did, the last man bringing up the painter with him and making it fast to a cleat. Then commenced a rapid search through the ship. In several places about the main deck they found broken lamps, and aft on the poop a shotgun, 3 revolvers, and several capstan bars lying about the poop deck. But though they pried into every possible corner, lifting the hatches and examining the lazarette, not a human creature was to be found. The bark was absolutely deserted. After the first rapid search, the mate called his men together, for there was an uncomfortable sense of danger in the air, and he felt that it would be better not to straggle. Then he led the way forward and went up to the topgallant forecastle head. Here, finding the port sidelight still burning, he bent over the screen, lifted the lamp, opened it, and blew out the flame, then replaced the affair on its socket. After that, he climbed into the bows and out along the jib-boom, beckoning to the others to follow, which they did, no man saying a word, and all holding their weapons handily, for each felt the oppressiveness of the incomprehensible about them. The mate reached the hole in the great superstructure, and passed inside, the rest following. Here they found themselves in what looked something like a great, gloomy barracks, the floor of which was the deck of the ancient craft. The superstructure, as seen from the inside, was a very wonderful piece of work, being beautifully shored and fixed, so that at one time it must have possessed immense strength, though now it was all rotted, and showed many a gape and rip. In one place, near the centre, or midships part, was a sort of platform high up, which the mate conjectured might have been used as a lookout, though the reason for the prodigious superstructure itself he could not imagine. Having searched the decks of this craft, he was preparing to go below, when suddenly Duthie caught him by the sleeve, and whispered to him tensely to listen. He did so, and heard the thing that had attracted the attention of the youth. It was a low, continuous, shrill whining that was rising from out of the dark hull beneath their feet. And, abruptly, the mate was aware that there was an intensely disagreeable animal-like smell in the air. He had noticed it, in a subconscious fashion, when entering through the broken superstructure, but now, suddenly, he was aware of it. Then, as he stood there, hesitating, the whining noise rose all at once into a piping, screaming squeal that filled all the space in which they were enclosed, with an awful, inhuman, and threatening clamour. The mate turned and shouted at the top of his voice to the rest to retreat to the bark, and he himself, after a further quick, nervous glance round, hurried towards the place where the end of the bark's jib-boom protruded in across the decks. He waited, with strained impatience, glancing ever behind him, until all were off the derelict, and then sprang swiftly onto the spar that was their bridge to the other vessel. Even as he did so, the squealing died away into a tiny, shrilling, twittering sound that made him glance back, for the suddenness of the quiet was as effective as though it had been a loud noise. What he saw seemed to him in that first instant so incredible and monstrous that he was almost too shaken to cry out. Then he raised his voice in a shout of warning to the men, and a frenzy of haste shook him in every fibre as he scrambled back to the bark, shouting ever to the men to get into the boat. For in that backward glance he had seen the whole decks of the derelict move with living things, giant rats, thousands and tens of thousands of them, and so in a flash had come to an understanding of the disappearance of the crew of the bark. He had reached the forecastle head now, and was running for the steps, and behind him, making all the long slanting length of the jib-boom black, were the rats racing after him. He made one leap to the main deck and ran. Behind sounded a queer, multitudinous pattering noise, swiftly surging upon him. He reached the poop steps, and as he sprang up them, felt a savage bite in his left calf. He was on the poop deck now, and running with a stagger. A score of great rats leapt around him, and half a dozen hung grimly to his back, whilst the one that had gripped his calf flogged madly from side to side as he raced on. He reached the rail, gripped it, and vaulted clean over and down into the weed. The rest were already in the boat, and strong hands and arms hove him aboard, whilst the others of the crew sweated in getting their little craft round from the ship. The rat still clung to the mate, but a few blows with a cutlass eased him of his murderous burden. Above them, making the rails and half round of the poop black and alive, raced thousands of rats. The boat was now about an oar's length from the bark, and suddenly Duthie screamed out that they were coming. In the same instant, nearly 100 of the largest rats launched themselves at the boat. Most fell short into the weed, but over a score reached the boat and sprang savagely at the men, and there was a minute's hard slashing and smiting before the brutes were destroyed. Once more the men resumed their task of urging their way through the weed, and so in a minute or two had come to within some fathoms of the edge, working desperately. Then a fresh terror broke upon them. Those rats which had missed their leap were now all about the boat, and leaping in from the weed, running up the oars, and scrambling in over the sides. And, as each one got inboard, straight for one of the crew it went, so that they were all bitten and bebled in a score of places. There ensued a short but desperate fight, and then, when the last of the beasts had been hacked to death, the men lay once more to the task of heaving the boat clear of the weed. A minute passed, and they had come almost to the edge, when Duthie cried out to look, and at that all turned to stare at the bark, and perceived the thing that had caused the prentice to cry out, for the rats were leaping down into the weed in black multitudes, making the great weed fronds quiver as they hurled themselves in the direction of the boat. In an incredibly short space of time, all the weed between the boat and the bark was alive with the little monsters, coming at breakneck speed. The mate let out a shout, and, snatching an oar from one of the men, leapt into the stern of the boat, and commenced to thrash the weed with it, whilst the rest laboured infernally to pluck the boat forth into the open sea. Yet, despite their mad efforts, and the death-dealing blows of the mate's great 14-foot oar, the black, living mass were all about the boat, and scrambling aboard in scores before she was free of the weed. As the boat shot into the clear water, the mate gave out a great curse, and, dropping his oar, began to pluck the brutes from his body with his bare hands, casting them into the sea. Yet, fast almost as he freed himself, others sprang upon him, so that in another minute he was like to have been pulled down, for the boat was alive and swarming with the pests, but that some of the men got to work with their cutlasses, and literally slashed the brutes to pieces, sometimes killing several with a single blow. And thus, in a while, the boat was freed once more, though it was a sorely wounded and frightened lot of men that manned her. The mate himself took an oar, as did all those who were able, and so they rowed slowly and painfully away from that hateful derelict, whose crew of monsters even then made the weed all of a heave with hideous life. From the Tarawak came urgent signals for them to haste, by which the mate knew that the storm, which the captain had feared, must be coming down upon the ship, and so he spurred each one to greater endeavour, until at last they were under the shadow of their own vessel, with very thankful hearts, and bodies bleeding, tired, and faint. Slowly and painfully, the boat's crew scrambled up the side ladder, and the boat was hoisted aboard. But they had no time then to tell their tale, for the storm was upon them. It came half an hour later, sweeping down in a cloud of white fury from the eastward, and blotting out all vestiges of the mysterious derelict and the little bark which had proved her victim. And after that, for a weary day and night, they battled with the storm. When it passed, nothing was to be seen, either of the two vessels or of the weed which had studded the sea before the storm, for they had been blown many a score of leagues to the westward of the spot, and so had no further chance, nor I ween inclination, to investigate further the mystery of that strange old derelict of a past time, and her habitants of rats. Yet many a time, and in many forecastles has this story been told, and many a conjecture has been passed, as to how came that ancient craft aboard there in the ocean. Some have suggested, as indeed I have been bold to put forth as fact, that she must have drifted out of the lonesome Sargasso Sea, and in truth I cannot but think this the most reasonable supposition. Yet of the rats that evidently dwelt in her, I have no reasonable explanation to offer. Whether they were true ship's rats, or a species that is to be found in the weed-haunted plains and islets of the Sargasso Sea, I cannot say. It may be that they are the descendants of rats that lived in ships long centuries lost in the weed sea, and which have learned to live among the weed, forming new characteristics, and developing fresh powers and instincts. Yet I cannot say, for I speak entirely without authority, and do but tell this story as it is told in the forecastle of many an old-time sailing ship, that dark, brine-tainted place where the young men learn somewhat of the mysteries of the all-mysterious sea. The Jonah, by Guy Payne. A sullen, shrouded gloom hung over the meandering Margaret, a bark of 15,000 tons en route for the West Indies. She was lying in the midst of a sweltering calm. Scarce a breath, a capful of wind, disturbed the sails which hung idly downward from their masts in loose folds. An oily sea washed lightly against the sturdy sides of the bark, so gently that it assumed a heaving motion repellent to the eye and the stomach. Not a flicker of a white-capped roller, never a splash as a tiny wave overtopped itself to break up in confusion, just a regular, smooth rise and fall. The crew of the meandering Margaret lounged idly about, except under the direct glance of the first mate, whose watch it was, when they carelessly continued their work with a pretense that deceived no one. The watch-off lay about on the foredeck. Below, it was stifling. The calm had lasted a week now, and during that time the ship had made a progress of 120 nautical miles. The oppressive heat seemed worse each day, while discipline became correspondingly slack. The captain was below, feverish. The second mate had died under the influence of the heat the day before, and so the first mate and the bosun divided up the watches between them. Superstitious to the last degree, the crew were hourly expecting tragedy, horror, death. The voyage had commenced badly. When the men signed on, they found as bosun the notorious Jim Green, Jonah of Jonahs. Jim Green had thrice been wrecked, twice on the cruel rocks of the Cornish coast, and once off South Africa. Each time, most of the crew had lost their lives. Once a boat he was on caught fire. It was a privately owned windjammer and uninsured. There was a subsequent suicide when the news of its total loss reached London. He had seen 4 burials at sea, and he was cross-eyed. The sum total made him one of the most feared men at sea, and no sailor ever willingly slept in the same ship as he. That was the first of bad omens. 3 days out, the ship's cat, black as coal, after giving birth to white kittens, jumped overboard. Then Miller, the second mate, died. Jim Green fished for sharks during his off time. He could not sleep, so to while away the time he trailed a line behind. There had been a certain shark following the ship for days, another evil omen. Pickled pork is a tasty piece, but though the line had hung down from the aft deck for 3 days, it was still untouched, while the shark still haunted the meandering Margaret. "Marky me words, lads," grumbled old Amos, a bearded, grizzled old seaman who had sailed the seas nigh on 60 years. "That shark's a-waiting for human food." "You're right, and I says so too," agreed Harry Bodley. Harry Bodley was a rat-faced, ferret-eyed Cockney sailor, a typical inhabitant of the sunless, insanitary, crowded tenements of the East End of London. A vivid scar ran down his face, making its appearance evil. Its sinisterness was farther enhanced by the cunning expression set deep back in his eyes. "Yes, old Amos, this here ship is cursed, that's what I says. What can you expect with a blasted Jonah on board?" There was a murmur of assent from the rest of the men, and a muttered growl. The watch-off sat round, blackened pipes and blackened teeth. 1 bell went. That is, 7:45 bells. In another quarter of an hour, 8 bells would chime, and the watch would change. Bodley, with one eye on the bosun to see that he caught no word of what he was saying, continued his discourse, while the remainder listened to him with an eager attention, every now and again interrupting with an imprecation, signifying agreement or expectorating skilfully a mouthful of tobacco-tainted spittle. The sun had sunk, a blazing ball of fire, and night had fallen. Still the meandering Margaret lay wallowing, creaking at every joint, where the tar had melted and oozed out. The bosun was leaning over the side of the ship, watching the fish leaping in and out of the water, leaving behind a sparkling shower of phosphoric drops which glowed as they fell back to the surface. Night had brought no appreciable difference in the temperature, and Jim Green felt as if he were slowly melting away. He wore no shoes and stockings, only a pair of pants, and a shirt rolled up above his elbows and open at the chest. Listlessly, he gazed overboard. Behind him, there crouched a shadow which turned its head this way and that, to see whether it was observed. Then it crept slowly, noiselessly toward the unconscious figure of the bosun. Other than the faint splash of the leaping fish, the creaking timber, and the helmsman who was whistling "Home, Sweet Home" in anything but a tunely key, the night was silent. The shadow sprang forward. There was a thud, and Jim Green sank to the deck. Instantly, the shadow, the rat-faced, ferret-eyed Cockney, lifted the body up and flung it overboard. The helmsman ceased his monotonous tune, cocked his head to one side, and listened. "Some fish," he muttered to himself. Before he had more time to cogitate on the sound of the big splash, he heard something else. There was a low, cooing, sibilant whispering, and suddenly the gaff topsail cracked like a pistol shot. The bark jerked forward. The sails billowed with a series of slight explosions. There was wind. Wind. The disappearance of the bosun was scarcely a 9 days' wonder, 5 days being its limit, for on the 5th day the meandering Margaret reached its destination. Inquiries had been made, and the only clue to Jim Green's disappearance was the splash which the helmsman had heard, and which significantly had preceded the sudden wind by a matter of a minute or less. The crew looked at each other queerly. No sooner had the Jonah fallen overboard, which was the assumption arrived at, than the prayed-for wind had arrived. Only the cunning Cockney knew the real truth, and he metaphorically hugged himself. He had paid back the beating up the mate had given him for slacking, and disposed of the Jonah with successful results in one blow. Therefore he was pleased with himself. Arrived in harbour, the crew decided on a swim. With a boat to keep off unwelcome sharks, 6 naked men disported into the transparent blue water. "Come on, what about a race?" yelled out Bodley. "I used to swim the old Thames, round the boat and back for a tot of stout and tonic." The men accepted the challenge, and 12 powerful arms commenced to cleave the water. Bodley lagged behind. He knew he could beat any one of the swimmers. In his younger days, he had been the accepted champion of the urchins who used to swim in the muddied waters of London's great river. He had a spectacular temperament, so he meant to give them a start, then beat them. As they rounded the stern, he was 2 yards behind. The occupants of the protecting boat watched the race. Bets passed. "My God!" shouted one suddenly. "Look!" The placid calm in which Bodley had been swimming a second past was now a turbulent mass of heaving water. "Shark!" hazarded one of the crew. "Octopus!" guessed another. Quickly they pulled toward the struggling Cockney, but as they reached within 3 yards of where the helpless Bodley vainly kicked his arms and legs to free himself of whatever was clutching him, he sank beneath the water. A few bubbles rose to the surface. The limpid water held no secrets. Some way down in the clear water they could see the body of Bodley, still and motionless. What puzzled the men, however, was some black, inert, seaweedy substance that was curled round him. "Blimey," muttered one. "Looks like as our Bodley got caught in some seaweed." Helplessly they peered down, stupidly doing nothing to rescue the Cockney, who could not possibly be living. Presently the swimmers returned. They heard the story, and one volunteered to dive below. His white body flashed beneath the surface, and within 30 seconds he returned with Bodley and something. The first thing that the crew saw was the horror depicted on the rat face of the late Cockney. Terror, fright, nameless, indescribable horror was writ on his features. Then old Amor suddenly vomited over the side, and with shaking fingers pointed to the something that was entwined round the dead body. Stuck on a hook, attached to a long line which trailed from the ship and had once been used as a shark hook, was a slimy, seaweed-covered body, decaying and mortifying, the face of which, however, was just recognizable as that of Jim Green, the Jonah of the meandering Margaret. Bells of Oceana by Arthur J. Burks. It was on a heavily laden troop ship westward heading. Hours before, the sun had gone down toward China, trailing ebon night behind her. For a full week, since dropping the California coast behind us, there had been nothing in all the wild waste of waters for us to see save ourselves. No ship's funnels broke the lowering horizon, no sign of land, for our skipper had chosen a passage lying somewhere in between the usual steamer lanes. The nearest land, save that which stretched in eternal darkness some 3 miles below us, was more than 1,000 miles beyond the southern horizon. We were just a single ship, burdened with a precious freight of souls, upon an ocean that seemed endless. The first day out had been squally, and everyone had been sick, save those of us who had gone down to the sea in ships before. But with the dawning of the second morning, the sea had calmed down, and our vessel rode through the blue, toward the horizon bowl which ever crept before us in the golden wake of the setting sun. The voyage, if the old salt spoke truly, would be uneventful, but with that strange premonitory feeling which comes to all of us at times, I did not believe them. Something, from the very first, warned me that our voyage was ill-fated. I couldn't explain my feeling. It wasn't a feeling of dread, exactly, nor of fear, just a strange feeling of unease, much like that which comes to people on their first voyage, when a ship is rolling slightly under their feet, and everything, until they get their sea legs, seems strangely out of focus. That doesn't explain it, I know, but it is as near as I can put my feeling into words. I knew, when the sun went down ahead of us, with the 180th meridian less than 24 hours ahead, that we were on the eve of strange, momentous happenings. To add to my feeling of unease, and as though it had been all planned out by some invisible something or somebody, in the vague beginning, the officer who should have had the watch that night fell suddenly ill, and I was called upon to take his place. I knew, as I donned my belt, holster, and pistol, that I but obeyed the will of some invisible prompter, a prompter without a name. We had 7 sentries out at various important places about the ship, and I made the routine inspections before turning in, less than an hour before midnight. When I entered my stateroom and turned on the light, that feeling of unease was more pronounced than it had been at any time previously. I had the feeling, though I had locked my door when I had last quitted my stateroom, that I had entered again immediately after someone had left it. Yet that was impossible. I had carried the key in my pocket all the time, and my cabin boy was not provided with one. There was no way that anyone or anything could have entered my stateroom in my absence, save... Still, as though my every move had been ordered by some invisible prompter, my eyes darted to the porthole beside my bed. It was quite too small for the passage of a human body, and even to think of such a thing were the utmost folly. If anyone had gone out through the porthole, that one had fallen or plunged into the sea, for had the porthole been ever so big, there was absolutely no way one could have left my stateroom by that way and still remained upon the ship, unless that one had gone out and were even now hanging by his hands along the ship's side. So strongly had the feeling of an alien presence obtruded itself upon me that, in spite of knowing myself an utter fool for entertaining any doubt whatsoever, I strode to the porthole and looked out. There was nothing, of course, save water, now black and forbidding, stretching away to the south, to a horizon that, since night had fallen, seemed to have crept quite close to us to watch our passing. Still unsatisfied, in spite of arguing with myself, condemning myself for a fool, I deliberately closed the glass which masked the port, took my seat in a chair beside the bunk, facing the round glass of the porthole, which resembled to an imagination suddenly fevered the eye of a huge one-eyed giant, and began to undress. Mechanically, I lifted first one foot and then the other, removing shoes and stockings. But I kept my eyes upon the closed porthole, and that feeling of an unseen presence in the room was stronger as the moments fled. My undressing completed, I stood erect to turn out the lights, and paused in the very act, a cry of terror smothered in my throat by a sheer act of will. For the most fleeting of seconds, I had seen a dead white face outside the glass which covered the porthole. It was the face of a person who had drowned, I told myself wildly, and the dripping hair wore a coronet of fluttering seaweed. The eyes of this strange outsider stared straight into mine, devoid of expression, totally unwinking, and the lips, which seemed blue as though with icy cold, long endured, smiled a thin and ironic smile. It took all the courage I possessed, which is little enough in the face of the unknown, to hurl myself across the bed, right hand extended toward the heavy screw which held the circular piece of glass in place. In the instant my hand would have touched the glass, the ship rode into the edge of the storm that was to fill the remainder of the night, and the stern of the steamer rose dizzily on the crest of a mighty wave, dragging all the vessel with it, and the face slid slowly out of sight below the porthole, the bluish lips still smiling, ironically. I admit that I was trembling, that my fingers were unsteady as I fumbled with the screw to unloose the glass. When the porthole was open once more, and the cold breeze of this latitude came in to fan my fevered face, I thrust my head out of the port and gazed right and left, and up and down, along the curving side of the ship. But there was nothing, save straight ahead on our port side. And even there was nothing but black water, huge mountainous waves touched with whitecaps at their crests, like flying shrouds or like lacy streamers created as a fringe for the mantle of night. I watched several of the waves sweep under the vessel, which rose and fell sluggishly. The waves seemed to be travelling in no certain direction, but broke into a veritable welter of warring forces, roaring as they came together with the roaring of maddened, deep-throated bulls. Valleys with darkness on their floors, mountain tops touched with snow that shifted eerily in the breeze. I was about to close the port when, many yards away from the ship, as though born of the womb of old Ocean, I heard the bells. Like the tiny bells which the bellwether wears to signal the ewes and the lambs, was the tinkling of the bells. Like those bells, yet not like them, totally out of place in mid-ocean, and I felt a strange prickling of the scalp as I listened. Hurriedly, driven by a fear I could not have explained then, nor can I now explain, I closed the porthole again, and whirled about with another scream, which this time came forth from my quivering lips in spite of all I could do to prevent. Just inside my stateroom door stood my sergeant of the guard, and his lips were trembling more wildly than my own. His eyes protruded horribly, his face was chalk white, and he was striving with all his power to speak. As I watched his manful struggle, I dreaded for him to speak, for I knew that what he had come to tell me would be something strange and terrible, something hitherto entirely outside my experience. "Sir," he managed at last, when I stiffly nodded permission for him to speak, "I just made the rounds of the sentries." Here the poor fellow stopped, unable to go on, and his knees knocked together audibly. "Yes, Sergeant," I managed to mutter. "You went the usual rounds of the sentries, and then?" "The sentry who should be on duty on the main deck, forward of the bridge, is missing." Of course, I knew on the instant that there might be many reasons for the failure of the sergeant of the guard to find the sentry, many logical reasons. The sentry might have quitted his post, a violation of regulations, true, for a quiet cigarette in the lee of a lifeboat. He might have been walking his post in the direction taken by the sergeant, so that the latter had not overtaken him, even with a complete circling of the main deck. He might— oh, there were many logical explanations, but I guessed instinctively that none of these reasons fitted the case. For one thing, the sergeant of the guard was an old-timer, had spent many years of his life at sea, yet he was frightened half out of his wits, and I knew he held as many decorations for bravery as any other officer or man in the Marine Corps. There was something terrible, something, if you will, uncanny behind this disappearance of the sentry. I muttered an oath, more to prod my own flagging courage than for any other reason, and started toward the door, motioning the sergeant to precede me. But he shook his head stubbornly and barred my way. I halted, for it was evident that he had not completed his report. "You'll maybe think me daft," he said, "but I couldn't let you go out there, sir, without telling you everything. The corporal on watch at the head of the promenade gangway told me a strange story just before I made my rounds. He opened the door leading onto the starboard promenade for a look at the weather outside, and just as he was about to close it again, the ship lifted on the crest of a huge wave, and out beyond the wave, many yards away from the ship, he heard something which he likened to the tinkling of little bells." "Good God!" I exclaimed. "And," the sergeant continued, "all the time I was looking for the missing sentry, I had the idea there was someone behind me, following me every step of the way. Yet when I whirled to look, the deck behind me was empty." "And you found no sign of the sentry?" I said stupidly. The sergeant shook his head. "Nothing," he said, except, well, sir, you'll maybe think me daft, as I said before, but on the spot where the sentry had stood to wait for me on my last round, I found wet marks on the deck floor, the marks, as near as I could tell with my flashlight, of bare feet." Mechanically, as the sergeant spoke, I had been donning my clothes, leaving my shoes, however, unlaced. I felt an icy chill along my spine as the sergeant continued, and I dreaded, as I had never dreaded anything before, to ask him further about those wet footprints on the deck. "The wet footprints," he went on, and he was talking wildly now, his words tripping over one another. So rapidly were they uttered, as though he wished to finish his report before I could interrupt again. "Led away where the sentry should have been standing, straight to the starboard rail. Right at the rail I stooped to examine the prints more closely. They were the footprints of a human being, I was sure, and the marks of the toes were blurred and very wide, as though whoever or whatever had made them had been carrying a burden in his arms." "Good God, Sergeant," I said again. "What are you driving at?" "Just this, sir. There's something terribly wrong with this ship. Something took that sentry bodily over the side." I believe that putting a name, however meaningless to what was in my own mind, caused a little of my courage to return, for I did not find it difficult now to bring myself to leave the stateroom. The sergeant almost trod on my heels as I hurried to the main deck, starboard side, where the wind wrapped icy fingers around me, chilling me to the bone on the instant. As I hurried forward, I looked over the side into the welter of waters, and stopped short. Behind me the sergeant groaned, hollowly, like a man who has been mortally wounded, for out of the waters, away to starboard, came the sound of tinkling bells. I darted to the rail and leaned far outward, striving to pierce the gloom. But there was nothing, save the watery wastes, mountains and valleys, and two spots of greenish phosphorescence far out, like serpents' eyes which watched the passing ship. But when I looked at them closely, straining my eyes, seeking the form below the eyes, the twin balls of eerie flame vanished, a wall of water obtruding itself between. Well, we found the sentry, sprawled on his face, where the sergeant should have found him on his rounds. I turned the body over, and it was quite cold, with excellent reason. The corpse was dripping wet, entirely nude, and the lips and cheeks as coldly blue as though the corpse had been dragged for hours on a line in the wake of the ship. No matter how secluded one's life may have been, no matter how carefully one may have been guarded during one's lifetime, there come into the lives of most of us certain inexplicable happenings which may never be forgotten. This matter of the dead sentry was one of these for me, and I shall go to my grave with the memory of his cold cheeks and bluish lips limned upon the retina of my very soul. Thank God that, at the moment, I could not look into the 2 hours or more of terror which, even then, stretched before me, else I should most surely have gone entirely mad. So many strange circumstances were there connected with this matter that, taken altogether, it is little wonder that I have been unable to forget or ever shall forget. The roaring of the wind which was lashing all the ocean into fury, a maelstrom in mid-ocean, ghostly white caps stretching away into darkness, into seeming infinity, the frightened sergeant behind me, his teeth chattering with fear, the dead sentry at my feet, his body blue with cold, entirely nude as I have said, the marks on the deck of huge bare feet, wet as though the feet had come up out of the sea, the eerie sound of bells between our vessel and the lowering horizon, and that dead white face which I had seen beyond the porthole of my own cabin a half-hour before. What was the explanation of it all? What was the cause of the bells, if bells there were? What had come up out of the sea to stride barefooted across the promenade deck of the slumbering troopship? Had my sentry seen whatever had come for him before he had been taken? Add to all these circumstances the fact that all hell was loose in the watery wastes, that it was now after midnight, and you will understand a little of my feelings. Never before or since have I been as frightened as I was then. I don't regard myself as a coward, nor am I ordinarily superstitious, but show me the man who is without fear in the presence of the unknown, the utterly uncanny, and I will show you a man who has no soul. I whirled, bumping into the sergeant, who manfully muffled a scream at my unexpected movement, and started almost blindly toward the stern of the troopship. As I strode along, with the sergeant at my heels once more, strange images fled across my mind. I remembered the tale of de Lorelei, the maiden who lured sailors to their death with her eerie singing, and strained my eyes through the gloom, seeking shapes I feared to see. Then my mind went farther back, to the years before I could read, years in which, thirsty for knowledge, I studied pictures out of old histories to satisfy my longings for wisdom. One of these pictures came back to my mind as I hurried aft, a picture of a hideous monster of unbelievable proportions, who had come up from behind the ocean's horizon, blotting out the sunlight, long arms extended into the picture's foreground, the right hand holding aloft a medieval sailing vessel, which had been lifted bodily from the ocean. A fantastic picture, I knew now, drawn to prove the existence of terrible monsters beyond the horizon to which, as yet, no caravel or galleon had dared travel. I wondered, as I strode aft, why this old picture should return to my mind at this time, and fear was at my throat again as I walked. "I am coming, oh, my beloved!" The words, high-pitched with ecstasy, came from straight ahead of me, and out of the heavy shadow cast by a huge funnel stepped one of my sentries. Just for a second, as he strode toward the starboard rail, I could see his face, and the face was transfigured as though the man gazed into the very soul of the perfect sweetheart somewhere beyond the rail. Slowly, step by step, as though he would prolong the joy of anticipation, the sentry, who had hurled his rifle aside, approached the rail, still with his eyes fixed on the welter of waters overside, while I halted, spellbound, to watch what he would do. From out of the waters, there came once more the tinkling of bells, and with the sound, as though the sound had been a signal, a huge shadow detached itself from the shadow whence the sentry had stepped but a moment ago, and loomed high above the luckless youth. At the same time, the ship climbed high upon a monster wave, so that her starboard side went down, down, until white water came over the side, and when she straightened again, shuddering through all of her, the sentry had vanished. From well rearward of where the man had disappeared, from out of the smother of waters, there came a single long-drawn cry, and it was not a cry of terror, not a cry of pain, but a scream of ecstasy. "He's gone, Sergeant," I said stupidly. "But what took him? Not the wave. He had but to seize the rail to save himself." "Did you see the shadow, Lieutenant?" the sergeant replied. I did not answer. He knew I had seen it. We strode on again, heading toward the stern of the ship, and all about us now, over the ship, on either side of her, but never on her, there tinkled the eerie, unexplainable bells. We stood at last in the very stern of the troop ship, gazing into the ghostly wake far below our coign of vantage, and with certain care I followed the wake rearward with my eyes. But one could not follow it far. That was the circumstance which impressed itself upon me almost at once. The wake died away, short off, within less than a dozen yards of the ship's stern, as though at the very moment of birth it had been ignominiously smothered. In a trice I understood the reason, and thought I understood many things besides, for, like a monster raft, stretching away rearward as far as I could see, and into the darkness beyond my vision to right and left, there followed us, close to, an undulating mass of odorless seaweed. Acres and acres of it there were, rising and falling sluggishly, but keeping pace with the troop ship through the night and the storm. Came again that sound of bells, and my hair stiffened at the base of my skull, when I saw, watching the seaweed, the result of the tinkling of the bells. The seaweed, when the bells sounded, seemed imbued suddenly with life that was utterly and completely rampant. Long tendrils of the stuff drew away to right and left below us, as though endowed with will of their own, and these tendrils, countless thousands of them, collided with other tendrils in the mass, and slithered over them so that all the mass of the seaweed writhed as though in torment, resembling countless hordes of serpents gathered together from all the evil places of the earth. And where the tendrils had drawn aside, I could see black water in the rift, as though the tendrils had drawn aside so that I might see. Some terrible fascination held me, my eyes fixed on that space of black water, for several moments after the tendrils of seaweed had drawn away to right and left, and up from the depths into the opening came two who filled all my being with abject terror, and something else. One of the two was dead, I knew on the instant, for I could see his face, all white and drawn, yet with the blue lips smiling, of the ill-fated sentry who had gone over the side before my very eyes, and he had been brought up from the depths in the arms of— I hesitate to give the creature a name. A woman? I scarcely know. Yet this I do know. In the instant I looked into her eyes, raised to mine for a full minute, I understood the ecstasy which I had read in the face of the sentry, whom she now held in her arms. Her breasts, nude and unashamed, were the breasts of a buxom woman, her lips as red as full-blown roses, her hair as black as the wings of a crow, a mantle of loveliness all about her wondrous body, whipping this way and that in the storm. Her eyes swerved away from mine, and one arm, shapely and snowy, raised aloft from the water, and to my ears came again the sound of tinkling bells. Once more the seaweed writhed and twisted, pressed forward about the ship, but a single mass of it detached itself from the larger mass, pressed close to the, should I call her woman, and swerved away again, and the arms of the beautiful creature were empty. Instinctively I whirled about, knowing somehow that I must move my head before I met this creature's eyes again, and stared forward to the shadowy portion of the promenade whence the sentry had emerged before his plunge over the side. Up the starboard side of the ship crept a veritable wall of seaweed, up to the rail, pausing there for a moment, then to the deck, where it writhed for a moment or two, taking a weird, distorted shape that made me think of a man, yet which I knew was not a man, before it strode into the centre of the promenade. From out of the heart of this monstrosity there dropped soggily a white, cold figure. The second sentry had returned, as the first had done. Why? What did all this unbelievable terror mean? I knew, as I searched through all my experience, seeking the key to this uncanny enigma, that we were heading westward outside the usually travelled sea lanes, that ships seldom, if ever, came this way, that in 7 days we had seen not one vessel, nor even the smoke of one upon the horizon. Why did not vessels come this way? But I could not answer my many questions. I could only ask them, and hope within me that they may be not answered ever. Nauseated by the return of the dead sentry, nude as the first had been, I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them again, there was no seaweed, no monstrous shape upon the promenade. But even from where I stood, I could see the wet footprints, and wondered whom next the creature of the deep would claim from aboard our ill-fated vessel. Resolutely I drew my pistol, and returned once more toward the stern of the vessel. This creature of the depths, whatever it was, had taken life twice. Whatever it was mortal, and whatever is mortal a bullet will slay. But in the very act of whirling I stopped short, for between me and the stern of the vessel, smiling dreamily, water rippling over her nude and glorious body to splash upon the deck, stood the creature who had come up from the depths in the wake of the ship, bearing the dead man in her arms. My arm fell to my side, my weapon clattered to the deck, and as I moved forward once more, slowly, a step at a time, as the sentry had done, the wondrous creature held out her dripping arms, and my eyes drank in all the glorious wonder of her, from head to... But she had no feet. Where the feet should have been, and the legs, there were neither legs nor feet, but a scaly column, wet and dripping, like a serpent with a woman's body. I screamed in terror and unbelief, but it was too late, and her arms were about me, preventing all escape. But with the touch of those arms I did not wish to struggle. I knew what had happened to the 2 sentries, knew the same was in prospect for me, yet at the moment there seemed nothing in all the world more worthwhile than to slip over the side, into the depths, with the arms of this wondrous creature about me. "Lieutenant! Lieutenant! For the love of God, what is happening to you?" It was the voice of the sergeant of the guard, frighted with abysmal terror. But I did not care. The shapely, strangely warm arms of the sea creature were about me, and the sound of the bells, unbelievably sweet now, was in my ears. For me the world had ceased to exist, save for knowledge that these 2 things were true. I was carried to the rail, and went over slowly, without commotion, as comfortably as though I had been riding on a couch of eiderdown, and came to myself, to know myself lost indeed. I was deep down, whirling over and over behind the whirling screws of the ship, holding my breath until my lungs were nigh to bursting, swimming with all my might, striving to reach the surface and life-giving air, when I hadn't the slightest idea which way was upward. With all my power I fought toward the surface, but my progress was slow and dragging, for there was a weight about my knees, as though arms were clasped about them, striving to hold me down. A wordless voice was in my ears, begging, beseeching, and there was something in the voice which made my struggles seem foolish and unnecessary, so that I desired never to reach the air I needed. I closed my eyes, which I had opened instinctively upon striking the water, and two lips pressed firmly against my own, and those lips saved my life and my reason, for they were the cold lips of a corpse, with neither love nor challenge in them. I flailed out once more, and my hand caught in the line which the steamer dragged over her stern to measure the knots she travelled. All about me as I was hurled forward, now under water, now with nostrils out for a brief breathing space, the mass of seaweed rose and fell on the heavy seas. God knows how I ever got back aboard the troop ship, but I awoke at mess call in the morning and sent immediately for the sergeant of the guard. "What happened after I came back aboard last night, Sergeant?" I asked abruptly. The sergeant of the guard stared at me as though he thought me insane. "I don't understand you," he managed finally. "Have we finally passed through the area of seaweed?" "Seaweed? Is the lieutenant making sport of me? We're 2,000 miles from any land, save the ocean bottom, and there ain't any seaweed anywhere. I don't understand you." "Let it pass," I said. "When did you last visit the sentries last night?" "Just before midnight, sir." "And were all of them at their post of duty?" "Yes, sir." "And what about the bells?" Again, the sergeant's puzzlement was so genuine that I knew he did not understand my meaning. How much of my experience had been real? How much fantasy? I tried another tack. "Did you make a round of the sentries after midnight?" The sergeant shook his head sheepishly. It is one of the rules of guard duty that one visit to all sentries must take place between midnight and morning. "Then the guard hasn't been mustered this morning. Is everyone present? You don't know? Then go at once and find out." 10 minutes later, the sergeant returned, chalk-white of face, to report that 2 of the guard were missing and could not be found anywhere aboard. He told me their names, and instantly my mind went back to the night of uncanny happenings just past, and the 2 nude bodies brought back from the deep in the arms of whom or what? I never knew, and to this day the questions I have propounded have never been answered. But this I know, there are strange things and sounds in the sea near the 180th meridian, 1,000 miles north of Honolulu, and this is the strangest incident in my night of terror. The clothing which I donned next morning was entirely dry, but my hair was stiff with salt water, and there was the tang of seaweed in my room when I awoke. I looked, too, at the glass which covered the porthole beside my bed. Outside that glass were the smudged prints of thin lips, the blur above them which told of a face pressed against the glass from outside, as though somebody or something had tried to peer in between nightfall and morning. And the bells? I still can hear them in memory when sometimes I waken at sea after midnight, and the rolling and the plunging of the ship tell me that a storm is making. The Man Who Was Saved by B.W. Sliney. Only I escaped. The man whom they had found adrift in the dory hung his head. The others, the listeners bent nearer to catch his throatily whispered words. The others, it got them. That monstrous, cursed thing. His eyes rolled back, showing bloodshot whites. His body tensed, and then he shook as with the ague. His attempt to say more resulted in shuddering failure. "He had better be put to bed," the ship's doctor said. "His nerves are all gone. Heat and thirst and exposure, of course. Hallucinations. He'll come out of it in time." So they put him in the hospital, where he raved for 3 days, and the things he said caused intense interest on board the freighter Pacific Belle, and among the crew, lurking fear whispered that some of the things he said were true. It was a week before he came into his right mind again, and then the fevers and fears which had beset him passed. He was able to talk to the captain, and to tell a coherent story. "There were 7 of us," he said with sad recollection, as he glanced at the ship's officers, who had gathered about him on the poop deck, who set out in a 2-topmaster, the Scudder. It belonged to Bob Henry, who was our captain. Just a sort of lark, you know, an idle cruise for the joy of the sea and the freedom. I was mate, for next to Bob I knew more about handling a ship than the others. And so we sailed along the coast, putting into whatever ports we fancied, and living an idle, ideal life. All of us had long been friends. Then we rashly decided to make it across the Pacific, depending on a season of few storms to aid us. We were successful. Honolulu was easy, and from there we headed southward, made the Marquesas, and then we sailed from island group to island group, you know them all, until we made the Philippines. There we turned homeward, pointing our course for Guam, but midway to a pier, our luck failed, and we were becalmed for days. We had a small auxiliary motor, which we used for a time to make headway, but it got out of order, and we were forced to remain in virtually the same spot for nearly a week. We did not especially mind, for we were in no great hurry, except that it was somewhat monotonous with so very little to do. One evening, during our becalmed period, just towards sunset, Hal Rooney pointed out a great disturbance of the water some little distance from us. It shot up in sprays, and eddied in a most inexplicable manner, and then it suddenly ceased. We wondered about it for a long while, but no thinking or imagining or deducing on our part could explain the phenomenon. Possibly, Bob Henry said, it will appear again. And, sure enough, it did. The next evening at the same hour we again noted that strange disturbance of the water. We knew that it could not possibly be a whale, nor any other large sea creature of which we had ever heard, for the tumult was too vast, and the fact that none of us could offer an explanation of the mystery piqued our curiosity. The calm continued. The sea floated away from us endlessly, equally on all sides, caught at the edges of the sky and became one with it. Once in a while, a blackfish went blowing by, or an occasional whale. The waters teemed with life. At night, the phosphor glow was almost livid, uncannily brilliant. And each evening that same disturbance of the water occurred somewhere in our neighborhood. It was with the 3rd appearance that the thing became too much for us. We determined to put out in a dory and investigate the next time it appeared. It did not disappoint us. Again at sunset, while the sky glowed extravagantly, flaunting an enormous batik at the parting day, the water almost dead ahead of our bows broke into a churning fury. We piled into the dory, which was ready alongside, and made for it, pulling as hard as we could. But before we were able to reach the spot, the maelstrom had ceased, and we gazed into the intense indigo of unruffled water that was nearly 5 miles deep. Following that attempt, we were more determined than ever to find out the nature of the thing. It was an amazingly large patch of sea that it churned, and, though the unbroken immensity of the space we were the center of gave us little for comparison, we judged the area to be approximately that of an acre, an unbelievably large expanse to show such agitation in the midst of so glacially calm a sea. The next afternoon, just as the sun fell into the sea, splashing all our horizons with myriad tints, a huge whale went lolling by, sounding and coming up with great jets of water cascading over it. I watched with the glasses as it drove powerfully through the water, peacefully taking its time. Suddenly, however, it changed. It displayed signs of confusion, of alarm. First it turned one way, then another, cutting about sharply, and then I very distinctly heard it give a groan of anguish. It was a heart-breaking sound, the cry of a great helpless animal in mortal distress. Immediately afterward, the water surrounding it broke into its daily wild disorder, and the Leviathan seemed gripped by a force it could not escape. It struggled violently, throwing its huge bulk about with futile effort. Greater and greater the melee became, and then, suddenly, the whale was still. We looked at one another, fright in our eyes. It was tremendous, awful. And then, as we looked again out there, the whale lost all shape, and the water became red with gore and blood as it was crushed to a pulp. In but a few minutes it was gone, utterly vanished from view. Even the bloodiness of the water cleared. The whirling and splashing ceased, and the sun went down on a still sea. All of us were speechless. It was the most dreadful thing any of us had ever seen. The speaker paused in his narrative, shaken by the memory of what he had related. The captain and his officers looked at one another with veiled skepticism. The doctor raised an eyebrow. There seemed no doubt of it. The man was insane. Presently he went on with his wildly impossible yarn. His listeners were attentive, but secretly unbelieving. In time, it was hoped, he might regain his mental balance. In the meanwhile, to say that we were shaken would not be half expressing our state of mind. It was so inexplicable, so wildly preposterous. I was for getting away as soon as possible, and so were several of the others, but the rest were keen to learn what the thing was. And, to settle any argument, the calm held unbroken, and the motor continued in disrepair, despite our efforts over it. For 3 days, then, the thing did not come to the surface. We had decided that it was some sort of deep-sea creature, some gargantuan monster that came out of the vast depths of the ocean to feed. But we had never heard of such a thing, save in stories of early navigators' superstitions. We hesitated to believe the thing we had seen. We were afraid to believe it. It was now that fear came to us. Hitherto we had been curious, idly speculative, and inclined to laugh. Now our thoughts were interrupted by premonitions of disaster. Flying fish, as they flashed from the surface and splashed into the water about us, startled, and porpoises blundering into our vicinity brought us all on deck. At night, a lost puff of breeze, slatting the rigging against the sails, startled us into alarmed awakening, and though the same subject of possible danger from the unknown out of the deep occupied the mind of each of us, it was never spoken of. But there was in the air a chilling presence of dread. I believe we would have left that place had we been able, for the memory of the fate of the whale was ever vivid in our minds. Following the death of the whale, the monster did not rise, however, for 3 days, as I have said. This gave us some sense of relief, but it was on that 3rd day that the great tragedy occurred. I was occupied with fitting a new seat to the dory, which was swung up on deck, and the others were idling, making bets as to the quarter in which the creature would next appear, or if we should see it again. I was startled by a scream from one of the men, and immediately after followed the sound of churning water, a sound which sent the very essence of dread all through me and cowed my soul. Somehow, I knew we were in the midst of the monster's rise to the surface. I stood and looked over the side. There was a horrible mass of pulsating green matter, a revolting substance that had no definite form, and yet was solid, a writhing, heaving island of the stuff. Even as I looked, it surged up from the water and rolled over the side of the schooner, turning over on itself, slithering and cascading on the deck. Every one of us was frantic. Some rushed for the after cabin, but they were cut off by a slimy arm that slid across their path. It spread and lifted with terrorizing rapidity. Two of the men tried to climb a mast. Bob Henry raced toward the bow and fell. An instant later, he was covered with the gruesome matter, even before he had a chance to cry out, and was hidden from sight. Hardly knowing what I did, I turned the dory over on myself, dragging Mark Whitmore, the nearest man to me, under with me. Fortunately, I had removed all the seats, and there was just room for the two of us as we lay prone. Then came darkness, and an inconceivably foul odor of decay, as the monster mass pushed itself over the dory, a suffocating, interminable darkness, while we were cramped under that flat-bottomed boat, scarce daring to think even of the horror that crawled over us. When we thought our lungs would burst for the want of fresh air, light came under the dory once more, and gradually the slithering, churning, swishing of that thing which had boarded us ceased. For a long while, however, we were too frightened to move, but finally our concern for the fate of our companions compelled us to lift the dory. The sky glowed with the last rays of the setting sun, and the sea slept beneath it undisturbed, but the decks of the scudder were wet with a yellow-green, malodorous slime, and silence hung like a pall over the ship. We called. There was no answer, not even the mockery of an echo. With consternation seizing us, we rushed into the after-house, but it was without a person in it. In a panic, we ran to the forecastle, and it too was suggestively deserted, and nowhere on that ship did we find a soul. Every man, except ourselves, had disappeared. That thing— His voice broke, and again into his face came that haunting pain. That thing had got them all. For a while he paused, making strong effort to overcome his rising emotion and the fear that memory brought him. The listeners looked away and were silent, and presently they heard his voice firmly continuing the tale. You cannot conceive of the terror which descended on us after that frightful discovery. Aimlessly, dazedly, we searched the vessel through and through, but we were the only men aboard the scudder. It was a fact that we had to face, but could not bring ourselves to believe. Night came quickly, and the moon and stars stared coldly down on us. We decided at length that to remain on the ship would be suicidal, for the calm still hung over the water like a dead thing, and the thought of the unspeakable thing that lived somewhere beneath us was appalling. So we fitted the dory with water and food, and rowed away in the night from that ill-fated ship. Then there came interminable days of torture under a malignant sun, and nights of terror of what might lurk in the waters around us. And one morning I awoke to find myself alone in the dory. The day before, Mark had talked of insanity, and I believed that he could not face the possibility. Now I attained the utmost in despair. I was, I believe, too shocked to think clearly, or I too might have gone over the side. From the morning of that discovery until you picked me up, I was in a coma. Of the passage of time I do not recall. And such is my story, gentlemen. You may find it hard to believe. I find it difficult myself, and wonder sometimes if it is not an insane conception of diseased imagination. I wish it were, but I am tormented with the reality. The Pacific Belle held her westward course for Manila. The story of the man who had been saved spread among the crew, where it was hotly debated and quite generally accepted. The officers of the ship, however, avoided the subject, and particularly before the stranger it was never mentioned. But one morning, just at dawn, a derelict schooner was sighted. The captain, awakened, ordered the Pacific Belle hove to while investigation was made. With closer inspection and increasing light, it was made out to be the Scudder of San Francisco. The man who had been saved was called. "Yes," he cried. "Yes, that's the boat, our schooner. But—" He drooped, swayed. The mate caught him and called one of the crew. "Take him to his cabin," he said, "and keep him there." Investigation corroborated the statements the stranger had made. Furthermore, the Scudder's papers proved beyond doubt that the man they had aboard came from her, and since there was nothing to indicate that anything else could have possibly driven the men from the ship, their strange passenger's story assumed a verity that even the officers reluctantly admitted. A short consultation decided the fate of the Scudder. Left as she was, derelict, she would have become a serious menace to shipping, and possible salvage value did not warrant the long tow into port. Dynamite was placed amidships and set off. With a splintering crash, the Scudder heaved upward and outward, and plunged into the deeps of the ocean. The Pacific Belle continued on her way. Later in the day, the captain studied his charts. "Do you think," he asked the mate at length, "that there is really anything in the fellow's story?" The mate shrugged. "Such things," he answered readily, "don't happen. He's off, that's all. All the men were gone from the Scudder, yes, but I'd hate to accept such an explanation for it." "The water in this part of the ocean, mister," the captain slowly said, "is 5 miles deep as the tallest mountain is high. It's barely possible that there's a lot about things out here that we don't know or even remotely suspect. However, that night, after the swollen moon went down, and after all slept, save the watches and the man who had come aboard from out of the ocean, the Pacific Belle plunged into stark, brief terror. The stranger, affected by again seeing the Scudder, had been unable to sleep. After hours of restlessness, he had gone to the bows, where he stared dully across the water. As he stood there, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he felt himself to be afraid. An odor had come to him, an odor which brought to his mind the horror of his last day aboard the Scudder, the sickening, decay-laden odor of the monster from the deep. Then he listened with super-intent ears, and above the vessel's vibration he caught a sound of churning, swirling water. He screamed with a loudness that awoke everyone on the Pacific Belle as he recognized these things. A scream that brought everyone to his feet, anticipating calamity. He turned from the prow and ran in stumbling haste across the deck and up the ladder to the bridge. The mate was there, alarmed at the cry of horror. "Mister!" he gasped, his mouth dry with panic. "Mister! The monster! Stop the ship! Reverse her, for God's sake!" The mate laughed with relief as he recognized the man. He had been in dread of something terrible, and it was only another fit. "Come now, old boy," he said in an effort to comfort. "Better quiet down a bit. Don't—" With another terrible scream, the fellow was gone from the bridge. Jerking a preserver from the rail, he leaped free of the Pacific Belle. "Man overboard!" The mate had seen him disappear and gave the alarm as he ran to the bridge controls. But before he reached them, the speed of the Pacific Belle slackened abruptly, as though it had fouled the meshes of a gigantic net, and then it lost headway altogether. A bright, eerie glow of phosphorescent green lighted the water in a vast area, suddenly bursting into a lurid brilliance which caught the vessel out of the night and revealed its helplessness to the stars. The glowing green mass surged sweepingly toward the vessel, piled against it, rolled over it, clinging to its sides, flooding its decks. Men who had come out to investigate the shouting and confusion frantically rushed below deck, barricading ports and doors behind them. On his bridge, the captain sent useless messages to the engine room. The ship could not move. Then, slowly, inexorably, as the brilliance of the phosphorescent light lessened, the great mass which was its source began to sink. Gradually it settled, carrying the Pacific Belle, fair-sized steamer though she was, down with it. The waves closed over the ship's main deck, touched and submerged the bridge, poured down the funnels, sending clouds of steam hissing into the air. And finally, even the tops of the masts disappeared. There had been no time for a wireless message, but a message would have been futile. Again the waters calmed, but after a half-hour they were torn for a few minutes by a great rush of bubbles to the top following the caving in from depth pressure of the Pacific Belle's bulkheads. But after that, the surface was never more disturbed by the Pacific Belle. Microcosmic in a terrifying vastness of water, a man floated on a preserver in the path of a liner that later picked him up. And, as he slowly realized the irony of his second escape, he sobbed with futile pity for himself. If you enjoyed listening today, be sure to subscribe to the channel by hitting the red subscribe button below. After doing so, click the bell icon next to the subscribe button to receive new content notifications. If you'd like to support our work and receive exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member by clicking the join button below. To support us in other ways, see the video description for links to our Bandcamp and Patreon pages, our merch store over at Teespring, and further information relating to our releases on Audible, iTunes, and Spotify. And until next time,